Over the frozen skies of Germany, January 1944, a decision was made that defied every rule of aerial combat. One pilot, 30 bombers marked for death, 14 attackers circling for the kill. Major James Howard looked at his fuel gauge, saw the numbers telling him to retreat, and chose to do the opposite. What happened in the next half hour would earn him the only fighter pilot Medal of Honor in the European theater, and prove that sometimes survival depends on someone willing to be called crazy. The winter of 1944 cut through flight suits and froze instrument panels. Ice crystallized on cockpit glass. Oxygen masks fogged with every breath. Above the patchwork farms of central Germany, contrails from hundreds of bombers stretched across a steel-gray sky, marking the path of the 8th Air Force's deepest penetrations into the Reich. This was the height of the daylight bombing campaign, the crucible year when American doctrine met German reality. The U.S. strategy rested on a belief that tight formations of B-17 flying fortresses, armed with overlapping fields of .50 caliber fire, could defend themselves against fighter attack while delivering precision bombs to factories, rail yards, and oil refineries. In theory, the massed firepower would create an impenetrable defensive sphere. Formations would fly in mutually supporting boxes, gunners covering every angle, and enemy fighters would be forced to break off or be shredded. In practice, it was a bloodbath. Luftwaffe fighters had perfected the head-on attack. Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf Fju-190s would climb above the bomber stream, roll inverted, and plunge nose first toward the formations at closing speeds, exceeding 500 miles per hour. B-17s had no forward-firing guns, only twin .50 calibers in the nose turret, operated by gunners who had 3, maybe 4 seconds to track, lead, and fire before the enemy flashed past or through the formation. Most bombers went down without landing a hit. The German pilots knew it. The bomber crews knew it. And the numbers proved it. Before we dive into this story, subscribe and leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. Now, relax, grab your coffee, and enjoy this beautiful story by January 1944. Loss rates on deep penetration missions regularly exceeded 15%. Some raids saw a quarter of the attacking force destroyed. Entire squadrons vanished over industrial valleys. Crews flew their tours in a state of grim arithmetic, counting missions like countdown clocks, knowing the odds said most of them wouldn't finish. Fighter escorts helped when they could reach the target. But in early 1944, even the new P-51 Mustangs were still learning their role. Doctrine kept them outside the bomber formations, sweeping ahead and on the flanks, hunting for threats at a distance. It was logical, designed to prevent collisions and friendly fire incidents. It also left gaps. Moments when weather scattered the escorts. Moments when formations drifted apart. Moments when 30 bombers found themselves alone in hostile sky with no one between them and the wolves. Into this gap flew thousands of young men who had never imagined combat at 25,000 feet. Farm boys from the Midwest, factory workers from industrial cities, college students who'd traded textbooks for bombing tables. They learned to fly in formation, manage oxygen flow, and operate guns through frozen gloves. But no manual taught them how to survive when the escorts disappeared and the enemy came head-on. There was no training for that, only hope and mathematics that didn't favor survival. The Army Air Forces tried everything: tighter formations, staggered altitudes, more escorts when range allowed. But fighters still ran out of fuel or got separated in weather. The bombers still flew deep into Germany, and the Luftwaffe still waited. The sound of those missions became a nightmare soundtrack burned into memory. The bass roar of Wright Cyclone engines at cruise power. The metallic rattle of gun turrets swiveling on frozen bearings. The snap and crackle of radio calls, bandit positions, altitudes, clock directions. Then the rising scream of fighters in their dives. The hammering staccato of 20mm cannon shells punching through aluminum skin. The sickening thud of rounds hitting flesh and bone. And sometimes, worst of all, the terrible silence when an engine quit or a wing folded and a fortress began its slow, tumbling fall toward Earth. It was into this maelstrom that Major James Howard flew on January 11th, 1944. James Howell Howard did not look like a man destined to rewrite the rules of air combat. He was older than most fighter pilots, calm where others burned hot, a thinker in a profession that often rewarded instinct over analysis. Born in Canton, China in 1913 to American missionary parents, he grew up surrounded by uncertainty, multiple languages, and the constant need to solve problems with whatever was at hand. His father ran a medical mission in conditions that would break most doctors. His mother taught school in rooms that doubled as clinics. Howard watched them improvise, adapt, and persist when there was no reinforcement coming. He returned to the United States for college, enrolled at Pomona, and studied pre-medicine. But aviation pulled harder than anatomy ever could. In 1938, he enlisted in the Navy as an aviation cadet, only to wash out for a minor medical disqualification that kept him grounded, not for lack of skill, but for a technicality that would have ended most flying careers before they started. It could have been over. For most men, it would have been. Instead, Howard went back to Asia. In 1941, months before Pearl Harbor, he joined the American volunteer group, the Flying Tigers, under Claire Chennault in Burma and China. The AVG flew Curtiss P-40 Warhawks against Japanese bombers and fighters with no spare parts, no reinforcements, and no room for mistakes. They were outnumbered in every engagement. Survival meant thinking 3 moves ahead, exploiting every advantage, and never, ever fighting by the enemy's rules. Howard thrived in that chaos. He learned to use the P-40's strengths, its dive speed, its durability, its ability to take punishment and keep flying. He learned to bait enemy pilots into bad angles, to use terrain and weather as weapons, and to make every shot count because ammunition was as scarce as fuel. By the time the Flying Tigers disbanded in mid-1942, he'd earned 6 confirmed kills and a reputation as one of the group's most reliable, unshakable pilots. When he returned to the United States and joined the Army Air Forces, he expected orders to the Pacific. Instead, he was posted to England and assigned to the 354th Fighter Group flying P-51 Mustangs, long-range escorts tasked with protecting the bombers on their deepest, deadliest missions into Germany. He carried with him one lesson that no training manual taught: when you're outnumbered and the odds are impossible, survival doesn't come from following doctrine. It comes from changing the rules entirely. The formative years mattered more than anyone realized at the time. Canton in the 1910s and 20s was not a place for children who needed certainty. Howard's father treated patients in makeshift clinics with whatever supplies could be scrounged or improvised. His mother taught classes in buildings that served triple duty as schoolrooms, meeting halls, and emergency shelters. Young James watched them solve impossible problems daily. Not with drama or heroics, but with quiet persistence and creative thinking. He became the kind of child who observed more than he spoke. While other missionary kids played loudly, Howard sat and studied how things worked, how people moved, how situations developed before they became crises. It was a survival skill learned early. In an environment of constant uncertainty, the ones who thought ahead stayed alive. When he returned to the United States for college, he seemed destined for something conventional. Pre-med at Pomona suggested a stable future, perhaps returning to China as a medical missionary himself. But aviation kept pulling at him. The mechanics of flight, the precision required, the sense that something larger was building in the world beyond campus. In 1938, he enlisted in the Navy as an aviation cadet. The rejection came swift and clinical. A minor medical disqualification, not skill, not aptitude, a technicality. For most men, that would have closed the door permanently. Howard felt the sting of being sidelined just as the world edged toward war. But he'd grown up watching his parents refuse to accept impossible as final. So he went back to China and joined the Flying Tigers. In that crucible, Howard would learn the one lesson that would define that day over Germany. When you're outnumbered, you don't win by being predictable. The airfields in Burma and southern China looked nothing like proper military installations. Dirt strips carved from rice paddies. Maintenance sheds cobbled together from salvaged wood and canvas. Parts so scarce that mechanics cannibalized wrecked aircraft to keep flyable ones in the air. The American volunteer group operated in permanent isolation, thousands of miles from reinforcement or resupply. Howard flew the Curtiss P-40 Warhawk, a fighter that couldn't outturn the nimble Japanese Zeros, but could outdive almost anything in the sky. He learned to exploit what he had. The P-40's ruggedness, its straight-line speed in a dive, its ability to absorb punishment and keep flying. Maneuverability didn't matter if you never let the enemy dictate the terms of engagement. Every mission became a calculated risk. Limited fuel, limited ammunition, no backup if things went wrong. Howard learned to pick his fights with surgical precision, using clouds for concealment, positioning himself with the sun at his back, thinking 3 moves ahead of his opponents. Combat wasn't about courage. It was about geometry, energy management, and never giving the enemy what they expected. The psychological shift happened gradually. He stopped viewing enemy tactics as unstoppable and started analyzing them like mechanical problems with exploitable weaknesses. Pattern recognition, predictable sequences, moments of vulnerability. By the time the Flying Tigers disbanded in mid-1942, Howard had 6 confirmed kills and a reputation among fellow pilots. Quiet, steady, unshakable. Not flashy, reliable. He rejoined the U.S. Army Air Forces expecting orders to the Pacific. Instead, he was assigned to England and the 8th Air Force. He had mastered how to stay alive while outnumbered in Asia. Europe, however, would present a new problem. An entire strategy built on sending bombers into a storm of steel. The 8th Air Force had built its entire strategy on daylight precision bombing. The theory was elegant. B-17s flying in tight formations, armed with Norden bomb sights capable of hitting targets from 4 miles up, would destroy German industrial capacity through surgical strikes. Massed defensive firepower would protect the bombers. Mutual support would keep them alive. The reality was carnage. Loss rates on deep penetration missions routinely exceeded 20%. Entire squadrons evaporated over the Ruhr Valley and Schweinfurt. Crews counted their required 25 missions like death row inmates marking days on cell walls, knowing the statistics said most wouldn't finish their tours. The problem was range. Early escorts, P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings, could barely reach the German border before turning back for fuel. The bombers flew alone over the heart of the Reich, and the Luftwaffe tore them apart. Even when escorts were present, doctrine kept them outside the formations, sweeping for threats at a distance, logical on paper, catastrophic in practice. Howard arrived flying P-51 Mustangs, the first fighters with range to escort, bombers all the way to target and back. He was older than most pilots he led, known for his calm, analytical approach rather than aggressive bravado. Fellow officers respected him. Crews noticed he didn't talk much, but always seemed 3 steps ahead. By January 1944, the air war had reached a breaking point. Losses couldn't continue. Yet commanders kept pushing deeper strikes, gambling that persistence would break German industry before it broke American resolve. The mission brief for January 11th targeted industrial facilities near Oschersleben. Heavily defended, deep inside Germany, guaranteed strong fighter opposition. On paper, it was just another mission in a long, bloody campaign. In the sky, it would become the day one commander's crazy decision kept dozens of crews from never coming home. The briefing room at 0400 hours was colder than the outside air. Crews huddled in flight jackets, breath visible, faces drawn as intelligence officers outlined the target. Industrial facilities near Oschersleben, deep in central Germany. Expected resistance, heavy. The bomber crews sat with the particular stillness of men doing mental arithmetic on their survival odds. Fighter pilots stood near the back, tense and focused. Dawn brought the roar of engines. Dozens of B-17s lumbered down runways across East Anglia, climbing into gray morning light. Howard led his P-51s up through the cold, forming on the bomber's stream as it assembled over England before turning east toward the continent. Then the weather closed in. Cloud layers thickened. Visibility dropped. Formations stretched and fractured as lead aircraft tried to maintain course, while others struggled to keep visual contact. Radio chatter grew confused, call signs overlapping, position reports contradicting, small navigational errors compounding into larger problems. The first enemy contacts came fast. German fighters probing the formation edges. Escorts peeled off to engage. Swirling dogfights erupted across miles of sky, pulling fighters away from their assigned bomber groups. The disciplined plan dissolved into chaos. Howard tried to reform his scattered elements, searching through breaks in the clouds for the main bomber stream. Then he saw them. A box of roughly 30 B-17s drifting alone, separated from the formation. He scanned the sky for other escorts. Nothing. In the distance, dark shapes were forming up. Enemy fighters, organizing, positioning for coordinated attacks. Howard glanced at his fuel gauge. The numbers were clear. Turn back now or risk not making it home. Then he looked at the bombers again. In that instant, he knew the numbers didn't matter. If he left, these men were finished. Howard's voice came calm and clear over the radio. He instructed his scattered elements to regroup at a safer altitude, stay clear of the engagement zone, or head home if fuel was critical. Do not follow him in. The responses crackled back. Confusion, alarm, protest cut short by discipline. He was their commander. They obeyed. Howard pushed his throttle forward and turned toward the isolated bomber group, fully aware he was flying deeper into hostile airspace, with fuel already running low. Every line of doctrine said escorts stayed outside the formations, swept for threats, maintained tactical flexibility. What he was about to do violated all of it. Inside the B-17s, gunners were counting enemy fighters forming up in the distance. 14, maybe more. The dread was familiar, that sinking certainty that came when you knew the attack was coming, and there was nothing you could do but hold on and hope. Then someone spotted a single P-51 approaching from behind. Relief flashed briefly before turning to confusion, then disbelief. One fighter. Alone. The German pilots saw it too. A lone Mustang heading toward 30 bombers with no wingmen, no support. They assumed he'd break off or get swatted aside in the first pass. They continued positioning for their standard head-on attacks, confident in tactics that had killed hundreds of bombers. Howard's mind worked through the geometry. He didn't need to shoot down every attacker. He needed to disrupt their attack runs, break their timing, force them into bad angles. He calculated closure rates, approach vectors, the precise position where he could cause maximum chaos. He rolled into position as the first wave of German fighters began their dive. If his own men thought the order was crazy, what he did next looked suicidal. Howard did what no fighter pilot was supposed to do. He slid his P-51 into the formation itself, positioning just ahead and slightly below the lead B-17s. Inside the protective box where turbulence from prop wash could tear a wing off. His aircraft bucked and shuddered. Gun turrets on the bombers swung toward him, tracking nervously, gunners unsure whether he was threat or ally. 2 German fighters dove head-on, expecting clear runs at the bombers. Instead, they found a Mustang directly in their attack corridor. Howard fired a burst and broke hard, forcing both attackers to peel away or risk collision. Clean shots evaporated. The enemy tried different angles, 11 o'clock high, 2 o'clock level, beam attacks from the side. Each time, Howard repositioned, blocking firing solutions, disrupting timing, turning calculated runs into aborted passes. Frustration rippled through the German formation. Their signature tactic, the head-on attack, depended on unobstructed approaches. Howard had removed that option. Inside the B-17s, gunners began to understand. They held fire when he crossed their sights. They started calling out threats over the radio. Bandits at 10 o'clock, climbing from below, reforming high. He became part of their defense. Howard's guns jammed one by one, reducing his firepower. Fuel gauges crept toward red. Warning lights flickered. In a waist gunner position, a 19-year-old from Kansas whispered prayers. A pilot watched the lone Mustang and felt gratitude, couldn't voice. A radio operator counted 14, 15, maybe 16 attack runs that somehow never connected. Howard's voice stayed calm on the radio, even as chaos swirled around him. Wave after wave pressed in. Wave after wave broke off. By the time the last wave fell away, the bombers were still flying, and the crazy commander's fuel was almost gone. Howard finally broke away, knowing one more engagement would leave him ditching in enemy territory or worse. He pointed the P-51 west toward England, easing the throttle back, nursing every drop of fuel. Every vibration in the airframe felt amplified, every gauge reading critical. Behind him, the B-17s waggled their wings, a silent salute visible across miles of sky. No radio transmission could capture what that gesture meant. Some of those crews would carry the memory of that lone Mustang silhouette until their last days. The flight home stretched into an endurance test. Fuel needles hovered near empty. The engine coughed once, twice. Howard made micro-adjustments to mixture and prop pitch, calculating margins that kept shrinking. His thoughts weren't on heroism, only on whether his math would hold long enough to reach friendly ground. An English airfield appeared through the haze. Howard brought the Mustang down, wheels touching runway, rolling, slowing. As the aircraft came to rest, the engine shuddered and died. Complete silence after hours of mechanical thunder and gunfire. Ground crews swarmed the P-51. Mechanics counted bullet holes in wings, fuselage, tail, evidence of attacks that should have brought the aircraft down. They stared at Howard climbing out, realizing he'd flown back from something extraordinary on fumes and will. Howard's debrief was characteristically brief. He recounted the facts without embellishment. Position of bombers, number of attackers, defensive maneuvers employed. No drama, no self-congratulation, just a tactical report from a pilot who'd done his job. If Howard downplayed what had happened, the bomber crews did not. And when their stories reached headquarters, the command realized they needed to look very closely at what one crazy commander had just done. The bomber crew debriefs told an impossible story. Men from multiple B-17s described a lone Mustang that fought like a whole squadron, disrupting attack after attack for 30 minutes straight. Intelligence officers cross-checked reports, expecting exaggeration or confusion. Every account pointed to the same pilot, Major James Howard. The decision came swiftly: nominate him for the Medal of Honor. It was extraordinary. Fighter pilots in the European theater didn't receive the nation's highest award. That honor went to bomber crews who pressed through flak, to soldiers storming beaches, but Howard's action defied categorization. Deliberate self-sacrifice, tactical brilliance, and a choice to face overwhelming odds alone to save others. The citation emphasized what mattered: extraordinary heroism, voluntary risk of life, protection of comrades against impossible numbers. His maneuver also changed doctrine. Commands began studying closer escort positioning, realizing that disruption and presence could equal firepower. Fighter tactics grew more flexible. Howard had proven that sometimes breaking the rules saved more lives than following them. Howard remained in the Air Force after the war, rising quietly through the ranks before retiring. He rarely spoke dramatically about January 11th, treating it as a tactical problem he'd solved, rather than a moment of glory. When asked, he'd simply say he did what needed doing. But the men he saved never forgot. Some named children after him. Others wrote letters decades later, thanking him for birthdays and grandchildren they'd never have seen without his decision. The story passed through generations of pilots as proof that courage without clear thinking is recklessness. But clear thinking with courage can change history. They believed their commander was crazy, until his maneuver crushed 14 attackers and brought 30 bombers home alive. Sometimes survival doesn't depend on vast armies or perfect plans. Sometimes it turns on one person who refuses to accept the logical choice to walk away.